Welcome to this week's Who the Folk podcast. I'm Lonnie Goldsmith, the editor of TC Jewfolk. And today we are joined by Daniel Volovets, doctor, psychiatry resident, and accomplished guitarist. Daniel talks about his musical roots and influences, when he knew he wanted to go into psychiatry, and how he balances the demands of residency with his love of playing, writing, and teaching music on this week's Who the Folk podcast. Daniel Volovets, welcome to the Who the Folk podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So you're in the middle, I guess, of a second career, and you're not that old to have sort of moved away from your first career. So your first career, if we'll call it that, is a musician, classical guitar player,
right?
A beautiful classical guitar player.
Thank you.
Music is tremendous. And now you're a medical doctor in the middle of your residency program for psychiatry.
That's correct.
What led you to, I guess, is it really truly a second career?
It is truly a second career.
It is true. Okay.
Absolutely.
It would be considered a second career.
Absolutely. So
you're too young to have given up the first career, though.
Right. So the way I look at it, often when people ask me what I do and I respond with medicine, and then guitar inevitably comes up and they say, "Oh, so that's your hobby, right?" I say, "Well, no, not really." I mean, so just to kind of preface that and give some background, I've been playing for about 20 years now. Started when I was 7 with pretty much predominantly classical guitar, and then kind of branched out into flamenco, Brazilian, and jazz and whatnot with a variety of instructors here in town. So kind of kept that up since then, and at probably age of maybe 17 or 18 began to think about medicine pretty seriously too.
Oh, okay. So it was something that you sort of went into college thinking.
Absolutely. Yeah. And actually specifically psychiatry I knew that I wanted to do.
Really?
Even in college. Mm-hmm.
Okay. What was it about psychiatry that you knew that was your path?
Well, so I had a couple pretty important experiences, I think. First and foremost, my mom is a psychiatric nurse practitioner, so I got a chance to both see her work and actually help her with some work. I was her transcriptionist for 5 or 6 years. And so that kind of gave me an inside look into what she does, and consequently kind of gave me an inside perspective on what I would like to do in the future. Otherwise, being able to shadow psychiatrists here in town as well, that was a great experience, specifically actually at HCMC, which is where I'm doing my residency now. And just seeing how those folks work and just the tremendous talent that they have to connect with people, regardless of their background, regardless of where they come from, that really inspired me at that time.
So, I think a lot of people when they're kids and they're growing up and they're learning guitar, they want to play rock and roll. They want to, flamenco, Spanish, classical. That's not typically where you see a lot of younger guitar players going in that direction. What was it about that? And they're very different. It's a very different guitar, the string, like it is, those are not the same thing.
No, absolutely.
What was it about the direction you went that, rather than maybe more mainstream, and I'm using air quotes, which you can't see, but
well, so we always had different kinds of music playing in the house.
Okay.
All kinds of genres, cultures, whatnot. So my background is Russian Jewish. Family came from the Soviet Union. Dad's family in 1979, mom's 10 years later. And ended up meeting here, and kind of, again, was raised in this family of very diverse backgrounds when it comes to all things, but particularly music. We had everything from French bards to the Gypsy Kings, Paco de Lucia, Brazilian bossa nova, Portuguese fados, Beatles. I mean, it was everything and more.
Yeah.
But for some reason, I gravitated toward the guitar. Parents had me start playing piano when I was 4 or so, and that did not go well.
Really?
No,
Didn't
not at all. I didn't take to it.
It wasn't that you were too young. It's just that you and piano not a compatible thing.
Nope. And I knew from the age of 5 or 6 that I wanted to play the guitar.
Okay.
But being the kid that I was, a little hyper, parents didn't really take me seriously. It took a little convincing, but they finally ended up getting this cheap $20 plastic guitar from the Mall of America, I believe, at the time. And I started picking stuff up by ear. So they would play Gypsy Kings, and I would attempt to pick that up by ear, age 6 or so.
Really?
And
that's not the easiest thing to pick up. I mean, Gypsy Kings are great.
Well, I wasn't playing quite like the Gypsy Kings.
I would imagine, but even like to hear enough to pick up some of that, that's not easy.
No, but I attribute that to constantly having music playing in the house.
Okay.
And actually, I'll bring up my brother at this point, too, who plays everything other than guitar, and I'm not kidding. So, literally, he began like many of us did with a recorder.
Mm-hmm.
Humble beginnings, but eventually ended up picking up flute, tenor and soprano saxophone, violin, cello, piano, and now he's a pipe organ major at the U of M. So he went kind of a ways there, but
wow.
Back to that first point is that I think having music being a constant presence in the house cultivated that predisposition toward music.
So how do you balance music, which it is clearly no hobby, but being in residency is no hobby either?
No.
How do you balance those two?
Well, so it's pretty new for me as far as the residency part. So I began about 6 months ago. But I guess kind of maybe rewinding that back a little bit from pre-med to med school and whatnot. So first of all, being in Minnesota for all of those was very helpful in that I had my family for support. But generally speaking, there were ups and downs in what I was able to take on at a time. So as far as the music side of it goes, I'm passionate equally about performing, teaching, composing, and recording. So trying to find a balance with that required some finesse. So I was only able to teach on the weekends, so Saturdays and Sundays.
Okay.
And then would have to, cut back on teaching. And luckily, students were extremely flexible. When I had commitments or whatnot, it would be okay, waiting another week. And then with performing, that's, again, kind of a spontaneous thing. If something comes up, you take it. If you can't do it, you can't do it. And with recording, I've been lucky to have a studio of my own for the previous 3 CDs that I've done. And that's allowed a lot of flexibility, too. Okay. And that, you can pick it up at 2 in the morning. And if you have an idea and you don't have anything the next morning, sure, why not? So that balance has been ongoing, I think. And again, it's required adjusting depending on what I have going on. Yeah. As an example, actually, right before residency, I had a few months off and released the new CD Masquerade and decided to do a little bit of a tour in town and then also perform in Boston through Berkeley, a few places in Wisconsin, and then in Indiana, also at IU.
And Berkeley is for those who don't know, is the Berkeley School of Music.
Yes.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And where in town do you perform?
Honestly, all over.
Okay.
I've performed at Cedar Cultural Center, Dakota Jazz Club, Russian Museum of Art. Yep.
So this feels like a very Dakota kind of vibe to your music.
Yeah, I mean, it's it lends itself well, I think, to a variety of different venues. Whether it's, I personally prefer not quite as large venues because then you can really connect with the audience, and you can. I like explaining the music too. Sure. Not just performing and then being pretty disconnected from the people listening to it. Yeah.
So you've put out 7 CDs now.
Mm-hmm.
Your first one in 2008 when you were 16?
Yes.
First of all, wow. Second of all, what are you recording when you're writing music when you're 16?
There was one composition on that CD, yes. But
was it otherwise it was rearrangements?
Yeah, so one of the other things I'm really passionate about too is arranging music.
Okay.
And so that actually comes from my first mentor, Anatoly Shapiro.
Okay.
Who is a guitarist who came from Kiev in '93.
Oh, okay.
And actually my grandfather's cousin as
Oh.
well. So runs in the family.
Sure.
But he inculcated that, I believe.
Okay.
In addition to Tony Hauser as well, he was my second mentor, a local classical, flamenco, Brazilian guitarist as well. And across all the CDs, it's either original compositions or, I guess the further you go, they're arrangements of my own as well.
Okay.
So those, that I think, again, that's one of my biggest passions too, is listening to a recording. As an example, it can be anything, actually usually not a guitar piece originally, and then finding a way for it to work on the guitar, which can entail, reharmonizing or retuning the guitar and whatnot, and just making it work for that instrument.
So, for example, the first song on the new CD is "Send in the Clowns," Stephen Sondheim, tremendously famous song. Not a guitar song.
No.
So, how much work does it take for you to? I mean, obviously, I'm sure you've been hearing that song. You've heard that song all your life. You know it well. But how, even with that, how long does it take to sort of break down the song and put it together in a way that works for you and your playing style?
Yeah, that honestly, I don't know that I can give a specific answer to. It really varies based on the piece.
Sure.
Some can come together in an afternoon. Some come together, a week or two and whatnot.
Wow.
But generally, I do like to give it that flavor.
Sure.
That's just a little bit different. Some reharmonizations and whatnot. But it's always fun.
It's amazing. I'm not I really like music. I am not musically inclined, so like when I meet and talk to people who are able to just sort of take something that familiar and blow it up in their own way, it's kind of cool.
It's a lot of fun.
It is I would imagine it's a lot of fun. So now we have been emailing to let people in behind the curtain a little bit for 6 or 7 weeks. We've been trying to connect and find a time, and your rotation in pediatrics sort of got in the way, which I understand. That it's residency, that happens. But how do you balance the demands of residency, which, as you were explaining to me before, especially with your last rotation, was incredibly demanding time-wise, with your love of music and of playing and of teaching and trying to find time to make that all work?
Well, some things had to go on the back burner during pediatrics. That was 80-hour weeks-ish. So at that point, obviously not recording or performing much. That being said, there was a week on that rotation where I managed to make it work to perform 2 shows the same weekend.
Oh, nice.
So I did a solo set with another group and then actually a trio performance. So it was a first performance of a trio with Ryan Picone and Ben Abrahamson.
Okay.
2 local guitarists. They do gypsy jazz, flamenco, all kinds of stuff, and that's been really fun too.
So when you join up with guys like that, have you played together before? Do you know each other well through the community in town, like through the guitar community in town?
Yeah, absolutely. And so we've actually been working on this set together over the past couple months.
Oh, okay.
But that is extremely fun too. That's another passion of mine, to get together with incredible musicians, and that's just a great learning experience too.
So how do you, I guess I'll have to go watch you guys play sometime, but in terms of trying to, your own, how you play and you know your style, and they all know their own styles as well. How hard is it to throw those together to come up with a sort of coherent set and, pieces of music for people to enjoy?
I think with these guys particularly, it actually came together organically pretty quickly.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So Ben specifically, his style of playing is flamenco and jazz informed. So he has that background. With Ryan, his is more gypsy jazz focused, which at first I didn't quite know just how that would work, considering that's not something that I've ever dabbled in before. But it worked surprisingly well, and it's just this really cool combination of different genres.
So if somebody, kid wants to play guitar, what do you tell them to sort of, not necessarily steer them towards the sort of style that you play, but help them understand that there is more than just, rock and roll guitar?
Well, actually, I usually begin by asking them what they want to play.
Okay.
With that being said, once I kind of reeled them in that way, I then said, well, to do that, you need to go through X, Y, Z. But it's done in a way where I actually try to grab their attention and not just overwhelm them with all these exercises and whatnot. And I guess my approach to teaching is I don't like to overwhelm a kid, especially if it is a kid, with all these exercises that don't have musicality behind them, I guess. And so at that point, it's just a kind of a balancing act between what would help them technically and then what would actually motivate them from a musical perspective. And, we would sit down together and I would arrange simple version of the Mario Brothers theme, for example, right? Seriously, right? I mean, it's just whatever they happen to like and enjoy, and we try to kind of meet in the middle there. And that's actually something that Anatoly did for me as well. So growing up on Russian cartoons, I wanted to play some of the theme songs from those. So he would take out some sheet music and come up with an arrangement on the fly. And inevitably, that's kind of what you have to do with some of these kiddos if you want to make sure that they continue to play, because otherwise you're just going to force feed them, whatever method book. And for some it might work. For others, they might tell you within a year, like, actually, sorry, I don't want to do this anymore. Yeah. Which I get, right? Because you do want to make sure that you can meet that kid in the middle.
And, I think for the most part, kids picking up guitar, they may eventually become good enough to be professionals, but sometimes they're just doing it to have fun.
Absolutely. And
bludgeoning them with method is not, I can't imagine, is always the best way to go.
Totally. And in fact, I almost wonder if kind of abstaining from that more rigid approach can foster future professionals more so than not, because everyone has their horror story of when they were a kid and they were forced to play etudes or arpeggios or whatever, right? But with some of my kids, I have a couple that I've been teaching for 5 to 6 years at this point on a weekly basis, and they are well on their way to proficiency.
That's great.
And that's been incredible.
I think it's interesting, and I mean, I may be way off on this, but I get the sense you're growing up in a home of Russian Jews. Mm-hmm. You hear the stories of around sports where in the Russian system where it was very, very regimented and very rigid. Yeah. And there is no coloring outside the lines.
Right.
And you had a mentor who's a Russian classical guitarist who very much let you color outside the lines.
Well, his career was kind of marked by doing that, actually.
Oh, really?
Yes. So he kind of went against the grain in a variety of ways, teaching back in Kiev. Ran into a number of issues sort of with going against the flow of government-approved music and whatnot, right? So one of his favorite composers is Villa-Lobos, who's a Brazilian. Among other things, he was a guitarist, cello player, but he composed over 2,000 works, ranging from, solo guitar pieces to full-on symphonies. And he, among other composers, were not necessarily the go-to in the Soviet era, right? So he still did his own thing, and he does have his own ways of approaching the guitar. Again, in many ways different, I guess, from what some people might do here, and that informed my approach as well.
But I mean, there's the whole idea of jazz, which is not just coloring outside the lines, it's what lines.
Exactly.
It's just throwing stuff on canvas.
Right. And so when it comes to jazz specifically, my background there is a little bit, I guess it's coming from a different angle. It's more along the lines of guitarists like Ralph Towner, if you're familiar with him. So these are guys who are classically trained, who are then jazz informed.
Oh, okay.
Right. So typically with jazz guitar, you might think of guys like Joe Pass, etc. Single line soloing, that kind of thing. But with guys like Towner, Lenny Breau, Ted Green, they did a lot of exploration of harmony.
Okay. And
that's something that Anatoly had encouraged me to do as well. Just try to experiment, and Tony as well. Try to experiment with these chords, see what happens and whatnot. And going through the theoretical part of it, but not in this rigid way. It was more along the way kind of deal. Like we would go through a piece, and then it would be like, okay, well, what are the chords doing here? Or what's the chord progression here? Why, right? So dissecting things as they make sense rather than just, okay, here's this theory without any context, especially for a kid.
Yeah.
You're not going to be able to hook a kid with just raw theory.
Right.
That's not applicable.
Right. So who's the, let's say famous, because that's, I'll ask it that way anyway, most famous person you've ever gotten to play with?
Play with or play for? Those are two different.
They are two different things, so let's start with.
Okay. Play with. So a guy named Yamando Costa was in town, amazing Brazilian guitar player. And he happened to be giving a concert through the Guitar Society here in town.
Okay.
And the night before that show, I got a call from a friend of mine who was hosting him. Maybe this was, 8:30 at night, and I had an OChem exam the next day. He calls me and he says, well, Yamando's in town. Do you want to come over and you guys can jam? Well, at that point, it was kind of a no-brainer despite the OChem exam. Of course, I went over there, and that was an amazing experience because this guy, he was just coming up with second guitar parts on the fly. And there's a language barrier, right? So we wouldn't really be able to communicate that way, but it would be like I would start playing a piece, he would know it, of course, and he's coming up with a second part. Then he plays something, I played back to him, and it was the whole night went like that. It was incredible.
How'd the organic chem test go?
I don't remember, but I think well, because I'm where I am right now, so probably not too bad.
Okay, and then play for, I guess.
Paco de Lucia.
Okay.
So Paco was in town. I believe this was 2014. Yeah, 2014. So he was playing at St. Kate's.
Okay.
And he is by far, I think, for me personally, the greatest guitar player. And I had seen him perform maybe 8 or 10 years prior to that in Chicago. Incredible experience. And then seeing him perform here, that was unreal. But the way in which I actually got a chance to play for him. So my third mentor, Humberto Wilkes, is a Dutch guy who was a transplant to Minnesota. His wife had worked for Cargill.
Okay.
And was on a 5-year assignment here in town. And this guy is a living legend of flamenco. He spent a number of years in Spain, kind of around the most fruitful era of the genre, so 70s and 80s. And he was friends with Paco as well. They didn't necessarily keep in touch kind of in the, previous 10 years or so, but back when Humberto was living there, they kept in touch quite frequently. And through him, I was able to get backstage after the concert, and somehow that worked out. And that was, I still start getting palpitations when I think back to that experience. But
that's amazing. And you got to meet him and just like play something?
Yeah, he was having dinner after the show, and Humberto said, why doesn't he play as you're having dinner? I was, okay, sure, let's head on backstage.
That's amazing.
Bit of a blur for me right now, because it's nerve-wracking thinking back.
I'm sure. I'm impressed and even a smidge amazed that you were able to stay composed to play.
I'm not sure how that happened.
Okay.
Because thinking back to that, I don't think I could do that again if I was put into that position again. But
no, probably not. I can understand.
No, but that was an incredible experience because Paco was and is one of my greatest inspirations too. So getting a chance to play for somebody like that was amazing.
That's incredible. All right, well, last couple of questions as we veer away from music and to Jewish. Favorite Jewish food?
Favorite Jewish food? Oh, well, latkes would be an easy choice. Yeah, I think I'm going to go with that.
Latkes.
That's a good go-to.
And favorite Jewish holiday?
Well, between Passover and Hanukkah.
Okay. Why Passover?
I like the tradition associated with them. I like the message behind it. I always just have warm memories thinking back to family occasions.
Okay.
Yeah.
And why Hanukkah?
Why Hanukkah? Well, easy answer would be the latkes involved.
Sure. No, listen, you don't have to go any deeper than that. I'm all about the latkes. That's fine. I was curious.
Again, just really warm childhood memories, too. Yeah. I'll go with both of those answers.
Excellent. Well, Daniel Volovets, thank you very much for coming in. The new CD is Masquerade. Your website, danielvolovets.com. Check it out and hear some of his music and find out when he's playing around town. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
The Who the Folk podcast is a product of Jew Folk Inc. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, rate, and review the show. If you have a suggestion of someone who should be on the show, please email me at editor@tcjewfolk.com. Also, go to tcjewfolk.com/podcast to listen to our new shows, We Won, Let's Eat, the Jewish Food Podcast, and The Jews Are Tired, a weekly recap of Jewish news through an analytical lens. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.